Hello students, in today's video I will teach you one of the best openings for black against 1d4, specifically against the Queen's Gambit. Our opening is not only going to be very good objectively, but also easy to learn from practical point of view. If you're an experienced player, I hope to show you some new ideas, and if you're a total beginner or just a beginner, I will be explaining the very first opening moves so that you could understand the video or most of the part of it as well. If you're ready, let's begin. Let's imagine our opponent plays the move d4. We're going to be responding with d5, and our opening is called Queen's Gambit declined. Here, white is going to play c4 and create a positional threat of removing our pawn, and later bolstering the center with the move e4. For this reason, moves like knight f6 here would be a strategic mistake, because white can simply take on d5, and after black recaptures, they get full control over the center. For this reason, we're going to be playing the move e6, so that we would have a substitute pawn for the one on d5. So now in this position, if they do take, we can take back and still have full control over e4, which prevents for now white from playing the move e4. White could here play knight c3, they could play knight f3. At our level, it's not going to be making a difference in this video. Let's imagine white plays the move knight to c3. They're trying to reintroduce perhaps ideas of playing e4, but most importantly, they're also applying the pressure on the square or the pawn d5. For this reason, knight f6 makes perfect sense. We're also fighting for the square e4, as well as guarding the pawn on d5. Here white has a big choice. We're going to be looking at two variations. One is where white delays or doesn't play at all c takes d5, and they will be more playing the moves bishop g5 and knight to f3. And we're also going to be looking what happens if white enters the so-called exchange variation or the Carlsbad pawn structure. That's how we call it. Here white plays the move bishop to g5. There are also other moves that are possible, but this will be likely the most popular choice. Another move which doesn't change things for us would be knight to f3. And with this move, black is really just trying to develop the king side first with bishop to e7 and castle. Most importantly, we're not going to be playing early c5 in our opening repertoire. We're going to aim for full development of the king side, then the queen side, and only then we'll be ready to play the move c5. As you can see right now, white has two pawns against one pawn in the center, which gives white extra central control and space. We're gonna play bishop to e7 in order to castle. White would play the move e3. They could also play knight f3 and a couple of other moves. It again doesn't change things for us. And we're finishing our development. I think so far the moves are very easy to understand. There are no fireworks. The ideas are very clear. White develops a piece, and it's almost always useful to win this tempo on the bishop. We're gonna play h6 and ask if the bishop wants to retreat or they want to take on f6. Now, most of the people think that retreating is the best, and probably they're correct. However, it's possible to take the knight on f6, and this is also considered a good variation for white. Let's briefly just discuss what would be black's strategy in case they take our knight. What we're acquiring here is the advantage of the bishop pair. As you know, two bishops are better than bishop and the knight in the game of chess, and eventually black will want to open up the position. The reason why I want to show you some of the moves here is because we're going to be playing slightly bit differently over here than in the other variations in today's video. What we're hoping for is white developing, for example, naturally with the bishop to d3, and we could strike right away with the move pawn to c5, and the position gets opened, which favors our bishop pair. For example, a typical idea after they take this seemingly free pawn would be queen to a5. Now we're attacking the knight twice. There's also a pawn on c5, which we're gonna get back. And here, there are absolutely no problems for black whatsoever. Just taking and utilizing the threats, taking on c5 or taking on c3 if they blunder is good enough. And we could follow up with a very simple and natural development of the queenside knight and the bishop. This is not likely going to happen if you're playing a better player. A better move for white would be rook to c1. And the big idea is that if we're going to play now the pawn move to c5, which would be a mistake, after taking and playing our move queen to a5, already we're not creating the threat against c3, only c5 pawn is attacked, which gives white time as they don't have to react and defend the knight on c3, and this position is not good for black. We're pawn down and it's not clear what is our compensation at all. So this calm move rook to c1, which seems to be very weird at first, is aimed at preventing us from playing c5. So we are gonna divert to another plan, which is to play c6 at first and open up the position for our bishop pair with the move e5. So white could follow this up with bishop to d3, we're gonna play knight to d7, white can castle, and here we're gonna take on c4, and after they take back, we're gonna play the move e5, and in theory, our bishop is already open, we will just have to move the knight away. Some example moves that could follow or happen in Grandmaster games are the following. I think very natural moves, and even if you're a total beginner, the move should be making complete sense. Black is just developing the pieces to active squares, and let's just say that black has equalized or is very close to equality. I like the bishop pair, I like that white has the isolated pawn. So this happens if they do take on f6. I would recommend more memorizing the ideas than the very move orders. That's the purpose of this video. And at your level, most of the opponents are gonna retreat with the bishop to h4. And here we have very simple development, only a few moves left in this variation for us. We're gonna play b6 before we play the pawn move to c5. After bishop to d3, we're simply gonna develop the bishop to b7. I would like to make a comment on the position of the bishop. I see a lot of students and players not liking the bishop here, but it does so many good things. It, first of all, presses the square e4, and maybe white eventually wants to play e4 if black is gonna be too late with counterattacking them. Another idea that the bishop provides us with is the ability to play knight to e4. And the knight on e4 is usually a great piece. White can never take it with the knight because of this fork that would occur on the bishop and the knight. And third thing that bishop does, and it's also important, is overprotecting d5. If you're ever gonna be playing c5, and we will play c5, position might get opened, and then you will see that actually this bishop belongs here to overprotect the pawn on d5. Do not play bishop a6 in this case. So after bishop to b7, we're going to wait for white to castle, play knight bd7, and play the move c5, and I think the theory ends for you over here. Black could follow it up with just rook to c8, ideas like knight to e4, and keep the tension in the center. However, it's also possible to change the structure by taking once on c4, d4, or even taking twice. If white was to take on d5 and c5, sometimes you can take back with pieces, but it's also sometimes alright to take back with pawns. The most common pawn structures that will occur from all this would be the hanging pawns. It's when two isolated pawns are gonna be adjacent to each other, or sometimes we're gonna have isolated pawns. So for example, if white plays a random move like h3, we could face isolated pawn positions from this. Don't think this is theory, I just wanted to make a point of what kind of things thematically could occur out of this structure. So now, as we go way back, I mentioned that it's possible to play completely differently for white and change the structure by taking the pawn on d5. And this is very, very important for me to cover in this video as well, because we're gonna have to play a bit differently or completely differently than in the previous lines. So after they take on d5, we still want to have control over e4, and we take with the pawn, not with the knight. White is gonna play bishop to g5, and very, very common mistake here would be developing the light square bishop to seemingly beautiful diagonal, for example, bishop to f5, And unfortunately, after the knight gets removed, we cannot take with queen because our pawn on d5 is hanging. And so if you have to take with the pawn, we don't like this, and we don't play bishop f5 for this reason. So instead, we're developing the bishop to e7. Now, white usually plays e3, and people might be wondering, can I play actually bishop f5 now? And the answer is not yet. We still need to have the move pawn to c6. Why? Because after bishop takes f6, now d5 is guarded, but there is the move queen to b3. And unfortunately, it's a very, very common tactical pattern in d4 openings. When the light square bishop gets developed, there is this queen b3. Here it's a double attack, and black is going to be losing a pawn. So black plays c6, and now they're perfectly ready to play bishop f5. Like, if white was to play a move like knight to f3, boom, bishop f5, and against queen b3, you could say, one of the moves that we could play is queen to b6. And this is considered very, very fine for black. However, white is not going to develop the knight. They usually play bishop d3 in order to prevent our bishop from going to the square f5. We're going to castle. White is going to play queen to c2. And we're going to play knight b to d7. This is very, very common position. Whenever I play Queen's Gambit exchange with white or black, I get to this position 99 times out of 100. And white has a couple of different plans. One is to play with the knight to f3, and usually they will try to execute a plan that we call minority attack. What is minority attack? Well, it's when fewer pawns attack more pawns. In other words, if you start pushing these 3 blue pawns, or actually white wants to push the b pawn and the a pawn forward, against the 4 pawns, we call this minority attack. If black suddenly would start pushing the 4 pawns against the 3 pawns of white, then we would call this majority attack, or pushing the majority. What is the idea behind white's idea at some point to play the rook to b1 and b4 to b5? Like, why would they do that? You see, the currently semi-open C file, which is the only semi-open file for white, doesn't give a lot of counterplay because the c6 pawn is actually not a weakness. It's guarded by the black's pawn on b7. Imagine a situation where white's b7 pawn is gone. Let's just say we take this off the board. Now that c6 pawn is way more vulnerable along the c file. So the purpose of the minority attack is to exchange some of the pawns, specifically the b pawns in this case, in order to create a weakness. A weakness means a pawn that cannot be guarded by other pawns, and it can be attackable, exploitable, usually on open file. So if they play knight f3, you could think of this, they likely, if they know what they're doing, gonna play the rook to b1 and b4, b5 idea. Another way white could be playing is knight g to e2. Then most of the time, people play f3 and e4 in order to create this center that we call mobile pawns, or mobile center. They're trying to overwhelm us with an extra pawn in the middle that they will acquire. The last plan that we're not going to be covering in this video is, after knight f3 or knight e2, to castle long. And then the position with opposite side castling occur, with all sort of pawn storms on different sides. And if you ever play openings with opposite side castling, you could take a lot of ideas from there and conceptually use them in this variation as well. So first, let's take a look at knight e2. Black usually plays the move rook to e8, white castles, and the way black later solves the problem with the bishop in both variations is starting with the move knight to f8, or at least that's the classical way of doing that. It opens up the bishop. It also sometimes allows our knight to go to squares like e6 and g6, and so a move like knight f8 shouldn't surprise you neither from white's point of view or from black's point of view. In reality, the biggest problem for black in the exchange variation of the Carlsbad, or exchange variation of the Queen's Gambit, is the bishop on c8. You saw how at the start we couldn't get it active, and white has always tricks if you just decide from the early stages to put it on g4 or f5. If black was able to just solve that problem, like let's say we teleport this bishop to g6, this wouldn't be at all problematic opening for black. Not that it is, but we still have to know quite a few things in order to equalize, just like in any other opening. But if we could just teleport it to g6, it would be like 0 0 0 assuming evaluation, meaning black is completely fine. White is usually setting up f3 and e4, but it's not easy for them to get this very early on because of this vulnerable d4 pawn. So they have to prepare it. And black is going to be using the time while white is making all of these maneuvers. They could be playing rook d1, rook e1, sometimes even the bishop comes back to h4 and f2. There are many ways to prepare that. But usually if they play pawn to e4 right away, it's very, very premature. Like, why don't we try it? Okay, it's black to play, but let's say we try to play the pawn move to e4 right away. What would happen is we could take, and you could see that there are some problems immediately that are happening. Black is super ready to attack the two mobile pawns that occurred, and white needs more development and more pieces that would cover those pawns after they open up the center. So white is usually playing the moves like rook a to d1. We prophylactically play the move g6 for two reasons. Number one is we're preventing any kind of bishop takes h7s, but two, we also want to get this knight sometimes to e6, to g7, and solve the problem of the light square bishop at last with the move bishop to f5 eventually. So, for example, knight to e6, we hit the bishop, say they retreat, and we could even follow the rajab of one of the top players over here, play the move b5, bishop to b7, then play the moves like a6 and c5, and we consider that black is close to equality in this position. Rook to c8, white is calculating a lot if e4 works or doesn't. Sometimes we could even play for the move b4, and I think that it's enough to know the opening theory till now. Also, it was possible for black to conduct the other plan with knight g7 and then the move bishop to f5. However, I like this b5, a6, bishop b7, and c5 a little bit more because of my counterplay that I'm acquiring on the queen side. So that's about this knight g to e2 line. Let's take a look briefly at as well knight to f3, which is probably a bit more popular, I think, although I could be wrong. We're still gonna play the move rook to e8 in order to get this knight to f8. And white is gonna start counter-attacking us on the queen side with a minority attack. We can play the move a5, not in order to attempt and stop them altogether, but rather it's always useful for black to exchange the a pawns, because his rook is no longer on the a file and our rook is. And so if we exchange the a pawns, even if we don't stop b4 to b5, we will still have the rook on the open a file. So black plays a5, white reintroduces the idea of playing b4. One of the moves that black would play is knight g6. There are so many plans here. I'm just showing you one of them. Takes, and here black is gonna try to conduct a kingside attack, starting with bishop to d6. The idea is that after takes and takes, we can take with queen, and the bishop shoots at the king side, whereas if we played some other move and we have takes and takes on f6, this bishop would be looking at the queen side where we don't want to be attacking. It's usually the white's king that black is gonna be hunting. And an example game would be b5, h6, kicking away the bishop. They don't have anywhere to go, so they have to take. And after takes and takes, black's plan is to continue the kingside attack, starting with maneuvers bishop g4 and knight to h4, and white on the other hand will be pressing the weakness on c6. The game in general is balanced. There were many possible diversions, but I hope you get the general idea.